Okay, so we got a lot to do, and I want to start going further in the Gemara. The only thing is, I didn't want to miss anything, and these are major. Each piece here is like a major has major ramifications in the practical life and practical brachos that we recite. So, what I'd like to do now is just sort of go over this law of chavitza and go through the way Rashi would learn it and the way Tosfos learns it, and how this will have practical application and how it's brought in halacha. And so,
are you going to get in halacha?
Well, we're going to try.
Okay.
So the Gemara on page 37a, which is what we did maybe last week or earlier this week, the Gemara had mentioned the law of baking bread from wheat and then cooking it. And the Gemara said that if the prusais or kayamais, if the pieces are intact, it's hamaitzi. Again, the bread was cooked in a liquid afterwards, maybe water. And the question is, do you still recite hamaitzi? So if the pieces are intact, and then it would be hamaitzi, and of course, grace after meal. If the pieces are not intact, the Gemara said that this was a brisa Gemara brought, and it said that if the pieces are not intact, you would recite a mezainis and recite the al hamechya. So that was on page 37a. Then we jump to 37b. Now, 37b talks about chavitza. And we mentioned that the way Rashi learns chavitza, it is you break pieces of bread into a pot and you cook it. So it sounds like very similar to what I just mentioned from 37a. So you have 37a talking about bread being cooked, and 37b gives a term for this, or at least one of the ways of cooking it is called a chavitza. One of the foods that would be made from in such a method would be called a chavitza. So it's very similar, maybe the same exact thing. It fits in the same category. It's cooked bread. And here, the Gemara mentioned that chavitza, Rabbi Yosef says, if it has a kezayis, if the pieces are the size of a olive, you would recite hamaitzi and the grace after meal afterwards. And if the pieces don't have a kezayis, you would recite mezainis and al hamechya afterwards. So how does this fit together with the previous Gemara? Again, 37a said it depends if the pieces are intact. 37b tells us that it depends if they're the size of a kezayis or not. And according to Rashi, we're talking about the same exact food. It's bread that's boiled, cooked bread. So you took bread, you baked it first, and now you're boiling it. And on 37a, the brisa said the law is that it would depend if it's intact. And the 37b, Rabbi Yosef says it depends if they're the size of an olive or if they're smaller than the size of an olive. If they're the size of an olive or bigger, then it's hamaitzi and berachas hamazon. You say the grace after meal. If they're smaller than the size of an olive, then it would be mezainis and it would be al hamechya. So, and the answer to this question, with the seeming contradiction, Tosfos tries to help us out. Tosfos tells us that that the way Rabbi Yosef is explaining the previous Gemara is he's explaining what does it mean it's intact. Intact means that it is the size of an olive. That would mean that the bread is intact because it's at least a substantial size. If it's not intact, the previous Gemara means that it's not the size of an olive. Okay, so fine. So now the way Rashi is going to answer this contradiction and explain it is that that's really the meaning of 37a. So we have bread that's cooked. After it was baked, it was cooked. And it'll depend if it's the olive size or not. And that's the meaning of intact or not intact that it's said on 37a. Then the Gemara goes further and says, so what is the law? We had an issue because it seems like maybe it could be hamoitzi, even if they're smaller than an olive. So the Gemara is bothered with this contradiction. Of course, we came up with some answers back and forth. And the ultimate conclusion in the Gemara is, so what is the law of chavitza? And the Gemara says, Rav Shesha says, this chavitza, even if it's less than the size of an olive, you recite a hamoitzi. And Rava says, as long as it has the appearance of bread. So again, we're now stuck with another sort of issue to reconcile. So how does this fit? So what we're concluding here is that it's not about the olive size. It's mainly about if it has the appearance of bread. If it has the appearance of bread, you will recite a hamoitzi. And the way this fits with the previous Gemara is now we're gonna add another understanding. And what does that mean? We're adding one little more a point to this interpretation. And what do I mean? So we first said it depends if they're intact. Then we said it depends if they're the size of an olive. And we said that's really the same thing. Now we're adding one more point, and that is that it's really about if it has the appearance of bread. But an olive size generally has the appearance of bread, and a non-olive size generally doesn't have the appearance of bread. So this is all goes back to that earlier brisa. So now we're combining 3 points and trying to explain that they all fit together. So first we said intact, then we said olive. Now we're saying appearance, and now we're combining all 3 and saying, you know what? It all boils down to the same thing. And this is the way Rashi is learning this Gemara, that as long as it has the appearance of bread, hamoitzi. Generally, what's the general rule? A kazayas, the size of an olive, has the appearance of bread. What if it doesn't have the appearance of bread? It's going to be mezainis and alamichya. When is that generally? Generally, if it's smaller than the size of an olive. So this really puts everything in perspective. Now, I don't want to interrupt with questions. I'd like to just tell you what the way Tosfos learns, then I'll take your question. Tosfos doesn't say that these Gemaras are connected. Tosfos learns, and I mentioned it over the last few days, that Tosfos says chavitza is not talking about cooked bread. Chavitza is talking about bread pieces, but they weren't cooked. You might have mixed them together with some milk. Maybe, in the olden days, they tried to be a little creative. They broke pieces of bread, put milk in it. That was their cereal, maybe. I don't know. They attached it, they mushed it together. They maybe put some soup with it. So that's the way Tosfos understands that this pudding is some type of a pudding type of thing. Now, I don't know how pudding is made. But what we're not talking about cooked. It's not cooked. It is bread that is not cooked afterwards. It is simply pushed together. Now, it's attached together, and I guess there's different ways it could be attached. It could be, number one is the pieces. We don't know how big the pieces are. And number two, are they totally, dissolved? Do they have the appearance of bread still? So this is chavitza, and the Gemara initially says chavitza depends if it's the size of an olive. If it's the size of an olive, each piece, in other words, you broke the pieces and then you attach them together. So each piece is the size of an olive, hamoitzi, and grace after meal. And if it's less than the size of an olive, it's not hamoitzi, it's mezainis, and it's the al hamichya bracha. Let's jump back to 37a. What did we say there? There we talked about bread that is boiled. In that case, what was the law about bread that was boiled afterwards? You baked it, and afterwards you boiled bread. There we said it depends if the pieces are intact or not intact. We did not say anything about the size, according to Tosfos. According to Rashi, we're connecting all these 3 Gemaras So we've got ideas of boiled bread has three things. Number one, intact, which means maybe it's the size of an olive, which means that it has the appearance of bread. Not intact means it's not the size of an olive, or probably, and it doesn't have the appearance of bread. So Rashi is combining, connecting all these three Gemaras. Tosfos is saying, no, they're totally separate things. The previous Gemara 37a is boiled bread. That bread that's boiled, it has one rule. It depends if the pieces are intact or not intact. Now, there is a Jerusalem Talmud that explains what intact means. And the Jerusalem Talmud does say that intact means the size of an olive, and not intact means it's not the size of an olive. So there is some connection with this idea of division of olive versus not an olive, size of an olive and not an olive. There is a source to say, even according to Tosfos, that bread that is boiled, it will depend on the olive or not olive. However, what's unique about Tosfos is that it doesn't matter if it has the appearance or not, because the Jerusalem Talmud simply says it depends if it's intact. Intact means the size of an olive. Not intact means not the size of an olive. In the Gemara later that tells us about appearance is not connected to boiled bread, according to Tosfos. That's the way Rashi learned. Tosfos says, no, we're not talking about boiled bread. We're talking about bread that's broken into pieces, and it's attached through different types of liquids, either milk or soup. However you're attaching it, you're attaching these pieces of bread. And so this is not, in here we say it depends on having the appearance of bread. So again, according to Tosfos, the law of boiled bread will depend if it's intact or not. And the Jerusalem Talmud says that means if they're the size of an olive or not the size of an olive, that's boiled bread. Now, if we jump to the case of bread that's attached to each other without being cooked, but it's just pieces of bread that are attached to each other, here that's called chavitza according to Tosfos. And here the Gemara tells us that initially it says they're the size of an olive or not the size of an olive. The Gemara questions a lot of things. The Gemara concludes in the end that Rav Sheshes explains that what are we talking about? That it's if it's not the size of an olive, it's still hamoitzi. Could still be the bracha of hamoitzi. And Rav Sheshes says chavitza, even if it's not the size of an olive, it's going to be hamoitzi. And Rava says as long as it has the appearance of bread. So according to Tosfos, the law of bread pieces that are put together are going to be a hamoitzi, even if they're less than the size of an olive, as long as they have the appearance of bread. If they don't have the appearance of bread, now you're going to have a mezainos and an alam. Okay, so that sort of summarizes these two opinions. Yes, Robert.
Yes, the question for me is after all this explanation in 37b, then we come to something that is called terokanin, which is again bread that is, it says, is made of a watery mixture of flour and water roasted in a cavity in a stove in the ground, but is not actually bread. So then how do we deal with that? It's neither, it's neither this or that, but it is flour and water. It is roasted. Obviously, it comes out as some kind of finished, quote unquote, product, but it's not bread. So that is a quandary for me.
So we didn't learn Tractate yet. We're still, that's the next piece of Gemara.
Okay.
And I don't see a major contradiction because I see that case as something different than what we're talking about. We've spoken now about bread that's been baked and either afterwards been boiled or afterwards been broken in pieces and put together with other pieces, but not a case of Tractate, which is really a different situation.
Okay, all right.
So it's not really not really connected, but it's definitely of interest, and we'll want to learn it.
Okay,
we'll hold on. Yes,
okay,
Susan.
Good.
Okay, Susan.
Okay, the bread you're talking about has already been made into bread. It's been rise it twice, put it in the oven, and it's been baked. That's the bread you're talking about.
Right.
Now.
We're talking about bread. Yes, correct. I don't know if it's risen twice. That just because.
Okay.
That's up to the baker.
In other words, it's intact.
It's fully bread. Yeah.
What you're talking about, even if it doesn't look like the original bread,
again, that looked like the bread is something that the Gemara discusses if it has the appearance of bread. It depends. There are certain scenarios where it needs to have the appearance of bread to be hamaitzi. And according to Taisvis, if it's boiled, we don't go by appearance of bread, we go by the size, according to Taisvis.
Okay.
So
All right.
appearance of bread is on the chavitza, which the question is, what is chavitza? And depending on what chavitza is, it needs to have the appearance of bread to be hamaitzi.
Okay.
Yehuda.
I don't know if this is related, but with pizza, if you eat a single slice, you say mazonos. If you eat more than a single slice, it's
Right.
a moti.
Right. That is the very common halacha that many people follow, although not everyone. But it's not connected yet. We're not really dealing
There's
with
some big slices.
We're gonna be talking about pizza in probably next week. Mitzvah Shem. But this is not the case of pizza. We're talking about bread that's afterwards, something was done with it afterwards, either boiled or it was broken in pieces and attached to other breads. Yes, Ben.
So is Rabbi Sheshet the halacha?
So Taisvis over here on the side says, V'chein kaimalon. This is what we follow, that Rav Sheshas together with Rava, a combination. Rav Sheshas and Rava, who explains Rav Sheshas. Taisvis says, V'chein kaimalon, this is how we follow. So we follow Rav Sheshas with Rava's interpretation, and Rav Sheshas would be saying that even less than the size of an olive, and Rava explains, but it has to have the appearance of bread, and that would be the rule. Now, according to this, so let me ask you all a question. What would be the law in a case where you have bread that was made into bread, it was baked, and then the pieces were broke off, you cut off pieces that are less than the size of an olive, and you boiled them. Now, you boiled them, they're less than the size of an olive, but they do have the appearance of bread. They have the appearance of bread, but they were boiled. What would the halacha be?
I'd like to answer.
Yeah,
if
Ben.
I can, I don't know.
Ben, yes.
If the pieces stick together, I would say Birchat Hamazon.
No. It has nothing to do with sticking together. It depends. It doesn't matter. We're talking about pieces that were broken, separate. Yeah. They're less than the size of an olive, and they were boiled afterwards. And they do look like bread. They still look like bread.
If they look like bread, then it's Rabbah.
Then what?
Then
you have Rabbah's law.
Said. It looks like bread.
So Ben wants to say it should be hamaitzi because you have Rava's law. And Simone, did you want to answer?
Yes, I was going to say, practically speaking, because I do make stuffing for turkey, where you break bread into small pieces and you boil it and you cook it. Once you've got a piece that's smaller than the size of an olive and you boiled it and cooked it, it does not look like bread anymore. So I would say it is not a hamotzi.
Okay, but it
looks like it does not have the appearance of bread.
Okay, I'm talking about if it does. So in other words, you're giving me a practical case, and that maybe we'll talk about that soon. But let's talk about a case that I'm referring to, where it does. You boiled it, you didn't stuff it in the turkey, and you didn't add some other oil and other things that maybe made it ruined its look. It still looks like bread, and I want to know what the bracha should be if that was the case. And if you can't imagine it, it's okay. But I'm just telling you, this is the scenario that it looks like bread. Maybe it was a different bread than you normally use, but it looks like bread. They're smaller than the size of an olive, and it was cooked. After it was bread, it was cooked. Now, what is the halacha? So Ben says it should definitely be hamaitzi, and his source is Rava. Rava says if it has the appearance of bread, you would recite hamaitzi. So it sounds good what Ben is saying. Anyone else? Yehuda, did you want to say something? Yes, Yehuda.
if it's smaller than a kazayas, then it doesn't get a motzi.
And what is your source?
I don't have one.
Okay, so you have a good point. And Yehuda's source is Taisvis, because according to Taisvis, chavitza is not when it's boiled. Chavitza, Rava's statement, so Ben is correct according to Rashi. Yehuda is correct according to Taisvis, because Ben is saying that it should be hamaitzi, because that's the way Rashi learned. The entire Gemara is all talking about boiled bread. And boiled bread, according to the way Rashi learns, ends up being, even if it's smaller than a size of an olive, if it looks like bread, it's going to be hamaitzi. But according to Taisvis, the way Taisvis learned, that the previous Gemara was the one who talked about boiled bread. This Gemara does not talk about boiled bread. So we have to look back at the previous Gemara. The previous Gemara said it depends if it's intact or not. Intact or not, according to the Jerusalem Talmud, which we're going to follow, it says that what does it mean intact? It means if it's the size of an olive or not the size of an olive. That's the bottom line. Bottom line is if it's the size of an olive and it's boiled, it's going to be hamaitzi. If it's less than the size of an olive and it's boiled, it's going to be mezainis. I don't care if it has the appearance of bread or not. It's mezainis. So according to the way Taisvis is learning, we only look at the previous page Gemara, because the page that we're on, 37b, is not talking about boiled bread. So we're only concerned, according to Taisvis, about 37a. And in 37a, it says it depends if it's intact or not, which means if it's the size of an olive or not the size of an olive. In Rava does not say over there about it having the appearance of bread. So what a bottom line is that this would be a scenario where you would have a difference. In other words, are we going to take this law of having the appearance of bread and apply it to even cases where it's boiled? According to Rashi, yes, because that's what we're talking about. According to Taisvis, no, that boiled bread is a category of its own. Bread that's broken into pieces and not boiled, it's just mushed together. Like, for example, let's say you had your stuffing, but you didn't cook it together. You stuffed it, you pushed it in afterwards. So that would be, you're attaching the bread. That would be maybe similar to this chavitza. Similar, I'm just throwing a thought. Maybe that would be similar where you're not cooking it afterwards, you're mushing it together. So here it would depend if it has the appearance of bread or doesn't have the appearance of bread. According to the way Tosis is learning, that's the way this would be. So
we haven't answered. What does that mean? The appearance of bread. What does that mean?
So that's a very good question. What does the appearance of bread mean? This is a little hard for us to understand, how to draw the line. Taisvis gives us we spoke about it yesterday. There is a Taisvis later that mentions, and we spoke about this yesterday, that if you stuck bread in water and the water turns white, that means that is a sign that the appearance of bread has been lost, because it has dissolved so much that the water is turned white. Then it definitely doesn't have the appearance of bread. It's just you can assume that doesn't have the appearance of bread. And I think what Taisvis is trying to help us understand is that it's not so simple to figure out if it has the appearance of bread. And this would be a way of, this would be one sign of it not having the appearance of bread. And Taisvis mentioned that there was a rabbi, Rabbi David of Mitz, that would put his bread in water at night in order to eat it in the morning and not recite Hamaitzi or Brochos Hamazon. And in order to give him strength, but he didn't want to come late. And I guess he was limited with time, and therefore he made sure to do that. And the idea is if the water becomes white from the bread pieces, so there's no appearance of bread. But what Simone is asking is, but what about other scenarios? And the answer is, you're right. It becomes complicated because we don't really know. It's very hard to draw the line. What has the appearance of bread and what doesn't? And I guess it would be hard also to express in words what that means, because it sort of depends on one's eyesight, and it really depends on the rabbi's eyesight. and really this could be something that maybe would be, it's a vague statement. We don't know how to, how to judge, scenarios like this. And we would have to be machmir in many cases. We'd have to be strict in many cases because we're not, it's hard to figure out. So it is a good question. So yes, Susan.
Okay, breadcrumbs, it's all from the same source, from wheat flour or whatever kind of flour you're using.
You ground up bread.
It's all from the same source. It's all bread. Whether or not it looks like bread,
okay, fine.
Does it really matter if it looks like bread?
Okay, so you're asking the next case. What about if it's not mushed together? They're just simply breadcrumbs, or if you grind up matzah. That was what we were discussing about Pesach. If you just ground up matzah, does it need to have the appearance of bread? This is a very good question. So what I'd like to, oh boy, it's 11 o'clock. Do we have like 5-10 minutes? Anyway, is that okay if we go a little over time? Okay.
Sure.
So what I'm going to do is
Rebbe, when you said you have to be machmir, we're talking about the bracha before you eat. Isn't that the Rabbanon, and therefore it should be lakula?
Well, there's also a chumrah of after you eat.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's hard to judge.
It's Amazon, right?
It's complicated. It's complicated.
Rabbi.
Yes, Moshe.
When we say achilat matzot on Pesach, Now, what are we saying now? I mean, this is just the fact that it's been the bread is not risen, has no yeast in it, and it's not it's not infected by water or any kind of moisture. Is this why we say that? I mean, basically, or
no,
we don't say alachilas matzah.
Mitzvah to eat matzah has nothing to do with what you're reading.
Yeah, we don't say
mitzvah to eat matzah. You never make that bracha again over Pesach.
That bracha is only recited at the Seder.
I thought it had another connotation. There was another reason as an addition.
I'm not aware of any other idea.
We don't say that over regular bread. A bread that's risen. That's rising bread. We don't say achilat hamotz. We say achilat matzot. We say hamotz and then we say achilat matzot.
Only at the Seder, because as Isaac says, because it's like a bracha on a mitzvah.
I see.
Okay, so bottom line is, so I'm just going to read for you what was brought in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, because I think it'll just give us a little clarity here how it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. So here it mentions that when you have bread that is cooked in a pot, the cooking does not take it out of the category of bread, that it would ruin the hamoitzi unless it is dissolved to the extent that there is no kazayas left. There's no olive-sized pieces left. And if any piece that is still an olive size after it's cooked would be bread and would deserve a hamoitzi and a berachas hamazon, even if it doesn't have the appearance of bread. And now, so what we're doing now is we're looking into the Shulchan Aruch. This is one from the Alter Rebbe. I will bring the other Shulchan Aruch, but I don't have as much time. So I'd like to maybe do that at the beginning of Sunday's class. But in the meantime, I'm just going to go over this because it's a little shorter. So basically, it comes out that the Alter Rebbe is following the view of Tosfos here. And he's saying that it boils down to if it has the size of an olive or doesn't have an olive, and if it's cooked and it is cooked to the extent that the pieces are broken down, that they don't have the size of an olive, so it is ruined from being bread, even if it appears to be bread. Even if it has the appearance of bread, once the pieces are less than the size of an olive, it is not called appearance of bread, and we would recite on it, a bayre mine mezainis, and al hamichya. And some say that it doesn't have to be dissolved through cooking, even if you broke it into small pieces and that are less than the size of an olive. And even if they have the appearance of bread on them, it's not considered the appearance of bread. And the law is that it would be mezainis. Now, of course, this creates a big problem. What happens if it didn't dissolve through cooking? It only dissolved through breaking it apart to make it smaller than the size of an olive. Again, there's two ways that the bread breaks apart to be less than the size of an olive, either through cooking or through that you broke it apart. But either it dissolved through being in this mush that it dissolved, or you broke it into pieces, and that creates an issue of what to follow. But the main point is that when it comes to bread that is baked and then afterwards cooked, we're going to follow Tosfos and say we don't care about appearance of bread here, because we follow a rule that the Gemara says on 37a that it depends if it's intact or not, and that means it depends if it has the size of an olive or not. And the Gemara is clarifying for us, if it doesn't have the size of an olive and it's cooked, then it is mezainis. And the way the Alter Rebbe interestingly adds in that even if it looks like bread, it's not considered appearance of bread, as almost like that's the rule, that the rabbis said that's not called the appearance of bread. If it dissolved and became less, and it's less than the size of an olive, that is not called the appearance of bread if it was done through cooking. Now,
Rabbi, can I just ask specific, just to put it more into actual practical specific things? So it sounds like bread stuffing or challah kugel or matzah brai would be mizonos, but French toast would be hamotzi. Does that sound right?
Yeah, the only thing is now we're jumping to another issue, and that is what is frying? Is frying considered cooking or baking? If frying is considered cooking, then French toast and matzah brai would fall into this category. We would have to see how big the pieces are. And if frying is considered cooking, so what we would say is, well, are the pieces the size of an olive or not the size of an olive? And then we would say, well, if it's less than the size of an olive, and they became that way through the frying, then for sure it'll be mezainis. If it was broken up that way, and you and it's fried, so then you would have this argument, this two ways of looking at it, because it didn't dissolve through cooking or through frying; it was broken. So then there are two ways within this situation of looking at it, and that would create a question. It possibly should be mezainos, because they are less than the size of an olive, and they're cooked. Now, if you look at frying as baking, if we would consider frying as baking, then according to that, it would be considered hamaitzi for sure, because all you did was rebake the bread. It's like toasting bread. So you fried it. You basically, like you're toasting bread. It doesn't ruin it from being hamaitzi. It's going to still be hamaitzi for sure. The issue would be if frying is considered like cooking. Now, if it's deep frying, then everyone agrees that it's cooking. But if it's not deep frying, but it's shallow frying, that type of frying is a question. And so we would be, we would have that issue of this question: is it called baking? Two different opinions. Okay. Now, what happens if a person puts small pieces less than the size of an olive, and they attach to each other? Or, for example, you didn't cook it in hot water. you just dissolved it in warm water, klisheni. So if it's in a klisheni, a second level vessel it's not cooking in it. It was like hot water was poured into a second cup, and then you just stick this in it. So if the size of the pieces are smaller than a kazayas, so the law would be that if they look like bread, you would still recite a hamaitzi on it. Now, if you left them in there to the extent that they dissolved and they lost the appearance of bread, so then it would be mezainis. Now, if the water turned white from the pieces, then it means that the appearance of bread has been removed. Now, if you just broke bread into pieces, this is Susan's question, which we really discussed yesterday. If you grinded up bread, so in that case, even though it doesn't have the appearance of bread, nevertheless, it's still bread, and you would recite hamaitzi. So if you get breadcrumbs and you want to eat it, you have to recite a hamaitzi on it, because breadcrumbs, it doesn't matter if they have the appearance or not. Breadcrumbs, so it basically boils down to three categories. Breadcrumbs alone, hamaitzi, or bread flour, if you want to call it that. Bread that's turned into flour. It's going to be hamaitzi if you ground up bread. If you mix the bread with some liquid and attach these little pieces, so it depends if they dissolve, or if they dissolve, they're smaller than an olive size, they dissolved, going to be mezainis. If they don't have the appearance of bread. If they have the appearance of bread, hamaitzi. And then if it's cooked, then we don't care if it has the appearance of bread or not. We don't discuss that. We only care if it's the size of an olive or not. And that is the way it's brought in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, the Alter Rebbe's Seder Brefus Hanenin, and